Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Board Explorer, and I'm back with another look or another attempt to do some learning and share what I have learned about the field systems in England and the early farming and all of that. As you know, I wander around looking at the landscape, heritage and nature, at least I try to. I'm not a historian and I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm a keen learner, and I just want to say thank you very much for everybody who has encouraged me to carry on with this series, who found it interesting. This is really just a means for me to try and get into my head some of the knowledge that I would like to have, so don't take this as verbatim. So I'm working from this book by Christopher Taylor, who was writing in the 70s, the mid-1970s, and he was a leading archaeologist of the time, and he writes so readably, if I can put it in those terms. I've tried to read other archaeologist stuff and it can be quite heavy, or as I've found with people like Francis Pryor, it gets into sort of fields of fancifulness and always talking about rituals and things like that, which half the time I'm questioning, how do you know? Anyway, Christopher Taylor is a lot more down to earth, and that's quite handy because we're talking about field systems. So this time we're looking at the Romans. You may remember in the previous two I was looking at the prehistoric, pre-written history, and we were looking at Neolithic, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and I've got some notes here which I have extracted that I want to refer to, so please excuse me looking at my notes as I try to remind myself the things that I've learned. So the first important thing that we should say is that the question keeps coming up, and people in the comments keep saying, they sort of almost doubt, and this is quite interesting that they do, that the population was as large as it was, and I can only go, I'm not the one saying this, I'm only going by what a leading archaeologist said at the time, that the population was much bigger than we originally thought. So, but when the Romans came, and they came in, well, originally 43 AD and then 43 BC and then 55 BC, but when they eventually came and did their thing and they invaded, the arrival of the Roman army and the subsequent conquest of Britain did not, this is interesting, result in a marked break from the agricultural development of this country. So pretty much nothing really changed in terms of the farming, certainly not at first. We've got to remember that the Romans, they invaded, but they invaded in a way that they didn't sort of bring all the Romans over and live here and slaughter and get rid of all the existing people, the Iron Age people at the time, the Celts or whatever you want to call them, the Britons. They came more to administer. So there was no alteration in the population of the country when they came, really, not in any sizable way. They came, they conquered and they occupied. And so there they are, ruling and trying to exploit the territory as much as they could, so that they were mining resources that they clearly wanted. We had iron and tin and all those sort of things, lead, that they could export, as well as clearly an agricultural system that was growing food. And they had armies, they were trying to keep their empire in control of everything, and everybody needed all these different materials. And so here was another country which could be exploited and kept under the thumb, whilst the ancient Britons provided them with everything they needed. But of course there was a bit of an exchange going on, because the Romans brought with them new technologies and new ideas, and you can imagine that there was of course some resistance at first, but in time some of these newfangled ways of doing things probably were eagerly accepted. We know what it's like, you know, out comes a new camera or the latest mobile telephone or anything like that. We do like something new to play with, and you can imagine that these things were looked at in awe by some of these earlier civilizations or these earlier people who hadn't seen them. I don't want to use the word primitive, because that, as I've said before, implies that these people were in some way stupid. But I don't think that's true at all. They're probably just ignorant of some of the new technologies, but very much open to them, I would think. So there were new ways of technologies, and the warrior chiefs who had their hill forts in the Iron Age and had these tribes that were battling one another. It seems, I guess the Romans came in and I mean, I don't really know much about this, but I assume that the Romans, therefore, by being this one military force, stopped all the inter-civil wars that must have been going on, and the warrior chiefs came down from their hill forts and probably became important members of society, like a local magistrate would be, authoritative within and a go-between, really, between the Roman organisation and the local people. So you can see that, whereas the farmers, the lowly farmers who were still trying to earn a living and be subsistent, just carried on in the same way. And it's interesting that the overall field structure didn't dramatically change. The landscape didn't dramatically change. I think that was what I found particularly interesting in there. However, some interesting things do go on. Let's have a look. Oh yes, now Christopher Taylor says it's important to remember that in terms of the Roman field systems, the only existing ones that we have to examine are the ones that were no longer destroyed by the Saxons, the Normans, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Georgians, the Victorians, and more modern day people. So the only field system, because obviously people have been farming on the good quality soil since the Romans, and so it's only on the worse areas of land that we've got these to sort of make a number of judgments on or see the existing patterns. And so while that's probably the same as everywhere else, he says it's just a cautionary note to be careful that you don't jump to the conclusion that just because you see it over here, it's the same everywhere. But, you know, without any other evidence to suggest otherwise, then that's pretty much, you know, a work in practice, I suppose. One thing that, of course, we do know is that a new plough or a new way of ploughing had come in. And that's very important because in the past you've had these hand tools, which, and I've speculated in the last one that some sort of plough must have been attached to animals to make life a bit easier. You can imagine that would have happened. I mean, these people were intelligent, they could organise things, and they were using iron when the Romans came in because of the Iron Age. And so it's not hard to believe that they were using animals to do something, but maybe they were still doing this crisscross because they were only really breaking the surface with some form of slicing action. But when this new plough came in, it came in with this 3 different elements to it, and they found archaeological iron parts to the old ploughs. The wooden bits obviously have since perished. And so you've got a change from the iron hoes and scythes and spades that they were using, which we of course still use, which is incredible really to think that these implements are that old. But the plough now could not only cut the soil, it could lift it up and push it onto the side using the coulter, the share and the mould board. So the coulter was like a knife that would slice the soil. Then the share was a horizontal knife, effectively, that would slice that way horizontally through the soil, and then the mould board, as the whole unit is moving, lifts the soil up and throws it over to one side, and I think usually to the right. So the advantage, of course, now is that you don't have to crisscross, and you can take these animals can go further. And so you started to see these square fields that hadn't changed once the Romans came in initially, that some of them now, those people who could afford to buy a plough, because I dare say they were expensive, but once they were being implemented, you could see the advantage of knocking two of the smaller fields together, getting rid of the boundaries, so that you have a larger field to plough, because it would make more sense and it would take less time than doing a small field and then moving all the whole unit round to another field. It would just make more sense. So that apparently started to happen, which is interesting. And what's also interesting, and I find this whole thing about the population absolutely riveting, really, that, and as Christopher Taylor says, and I wrote this down, literally thousands of Roman settlements are now known, from towns, villages, hamlets, villas and single farmsteads on highland and on lowland. And one of the reasons is that I think one of my contributors said that it was unlikely that the Weald had been cultivated because it was very muddy and clayey and very difficult. But he seems to suggest that there wasn't anywhere that really, now this plough had come in and had made really heavy soils a lot easier, that perhaps had been too much of a challenge for the Neolithic people, that they could now do this ploughing in all sorts of terrain, on lowlands and highlands, on highlands rather than and lowlands. And he says that the accepted population that had been given of about 2 million people in England was far too low, and suspected it was much, much higher. And he also says that the villas, or rather these farms, the populations in these villages, were far closer together than we'd ever previously seen. And in fact, as we go into the Saxon period, I've read the whole book now, but in the Saxon period, when we get to it, the settlements are incredibly overpopulated and very, very close together. I think it's blown some of my ideas that they were fewer of them, and actually it was far more populated. And I keep repeating this because it's so astounding to me. And to feed so many, the land needed to be brought into cultivation. So hence with the plough, they could go and tackle these extra fields that perhaps wouldn't done. There was this business of long fields. So some of these smaller fields, which were knocked into 2 fields, some were knocked into possibly 4 or 5 fields, and so they're quite unusual, and they're almost strip-like, but not to be confused with the strips from the open fields that came around 900 AD to 1200, where we see a completely different type of farming altogether. So these open fields didn't come from this period. I think that's an important thing to state. He goes on and talks about the fens, or the fenlands in East Anglia, and how they were drained and how they were populated and how the farming went there. And I don't know too much about that, and it's not an area I know too much about, really, and I need to go and visit and walk around. And actually somebody else said, wouldn't it be great to go and visit some of these fields and look at them? And absolutely it would, but it's not just, a question of, I just nip out and go to them. You've got to know these are the right fields, and you've got to know exactly what you're looking for. And I'm in the early stages of learning this, and of course we're in lockdown, so it's not as easy just to sort of nip out and go and have a look at some fields. Plus you've got to get permission to fly your drone, because you can only see things from above and in the right light, and who knows now what's left. Now he goes on to talk about an interesting type of field system that the Romans were known for in their entire empire and elsewhere, which is the mathematically surveyed fields. They were incredible innovators and exponents of engineering, and one of the things was this thing called centuriation. I think that's how it's pronounced, which is how these fields are laid out in massive grids. And apparently in the rest of the empire there's loads of these, the evidence for all this massive grids. They would come in and they would divide them up in a I guess a much more what would you say, in a more productive method, really. But there's barely any evidence, if any, that there was anything like that in this country. Now, why, he says, why is there none of this? They were doing this everywhere else. There is possibly, he cites Rochester as one, and even West Blatchington near Brighton as another area where some mathematically surveyed fields could be, but some of the measurements are not typical. So why has that not happened? And he says, well, one theory is simply that when the Romans came over, they found this land by the time of the Iron Age so well farmed and populated and cultivated that the field systems were already in place, that to change it became pretty much unnecessary, because it wasn't virgin land. There was a huge population, or a large population, and the fields were already being worked, and all they needed to do was to come in and claim that they were now the owners, they were now in control, and just get these farmers to carry on farming. So the upheaval to do all this and the surveying and everything else was unnecessary. So that, I found that very interesting. So to sum up in this, because I don't want these to go on too long, and I realise, you know, a lot of it is me waffling as I'm trying to get this into my head. The Roman fields had a wide variety of shapes. So they had the original square shapes, and they kept those, and they kept going on that the Neolithic people had. But they had these oblong shapes and sort of strip shapes. They had wider, quite large fields for stock, because they had stock and they were very important. The villas and the farmsteads and all that were much closer together, and more of them than we'd ever thought. They grew cereal and grain, but also beans, peas, turnips and flax. And it makes you wonder whether they had at that point known about putting peas and legumes and things in to put nitrogen or goodness, as they would have seen it, back into the soil. I don't know. Root crops they grew, which they suggest a lot of that may have been for their animals. So at this point they're deliberately growing food for the animal stock, which is interesting. And sheep for wool principally, which is again what we latterly did in the Middle Ages. So fascinating stuff. I hope it's been of interest, and yes, I'd love to go and visit some of these things and learn more. And I have been looking at the road systems and the tracks that the Romans came in and how they surveyed them as well. So there's a whole lot in this period to explore as part of our English history. So I hope that's been of interest. Anyway, I'll be out and about doing my normal walks and what have you, and looking at the landscape, but it makes me look at it in a completely new and interesting way. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow, like, and become a patron, support what I do. That would help. And in the meantime, I'll see you on another video. Till then, bye-bye. Bye-bye.